April 1945. In a hidden corner of Bavaria, 300 German women waited for death. They had been told exactly what American soldiers would do to them. They were completely wrong. The Third Reich was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane, yet deep in the remote Bavarian forests, a forgotten horror remained carefully hidden from the advancing Allied forces. Behind layers of rusted barbed wire and crumbling wooden watchtowers stood a labor camp that housed not captured soldiers or political prisoners, but nearly 300 German women who had been ruthlessly consumed by the grinding machinery of Hitler's total war. The camp sprawled across a desolate forest clearing where magnificent ancient pine trees had been brutally cut down years earlier to make room for this monument to human suffering. Rows of gray wooden barracks stretched endlessly in perfect military formation, their weathered walls scarred by countless violent storms and systematic neglect. The hastily constructed structures leaked torrentially when it rained, sending streams of dirty water cascading through the overcrowded sleeping quarters. Bitter drafts whistled mercilessly through widening gaps in the rotting boards during the harsh Bavarian winters, making sleep nearly impossible for the malnourished inhabitants. Inside these rapidly deteriorating buildings, women existed in conditions so appalling they would have horrified even the most battle-hardened soldiers who had witnessed the worst carnage of the European theater. The prisoners were crammed together like livestock, sleeping on moldy straw mattresses that hadn't been changed in months, sharing blankets so thin they provided virtually no protection against the penetrating cold. The women ranged dramatically in age from frightened teenagers barely 18 to exhausted grandmothers well past 60, united only by their shared imprisonment in Hitler's increasingly desperate industrial machine. Most had been violently swept from their comfortable homes between 1943 and 1944, when the Reich's insatiable hunger for forced workers had become absolutely ravenous. Factory seamstresses with calloused fingers, village school teachers with gentle voices, farmers' daughters with sun-weathered skin, shopkeepers' wives who had once known prosperity. Nazi authorities had cynically promised them meaningful, patriotic work serving the glorious fatherland. Government officials had spoken eloquently of duty, sacrifice, and the honor of contributing to Germany's inevitable victory. Instead, these deceived women found themselves manufacturing ammunition and weapons components in suffocating underground facilities, toiling relentlessly through grueling 16-hour shifts with increasingly meager food rations and rapidly vanishing hope for survival or rescue. When intensifying Allied bombing campaigns made their original industrial locations far too dangerous to continue operations, the women had been hastily transported here, to this deliberately isolated corner of Bavaria that existed on no official military maps or government records. The nightmarish journey itself had been a prolonged ordeal of overcrowded cattle cars and brutal forced marches, during which many of the weaker prisoners had simply collapsed from exhaustion and been callously left behind to die. Now, they somehow survived each day on watery potato soup that contained more dirt than vegetables and irregular chunks of black bread that often contained sawdust, wood chips, and other inedible fillers. Their once decent clothing hung pathetically in threadbare patches, mended and desperately remended until the original fabric was barely recognizable beneath countless layers of crude repairs made with whatever scraps they could find. Severe malnutrition had dramatically hollowed their once full cheeks and dulled their previously bright eyes until they resembled walking skeletons more than living human beings. Dysentery swept mercilessly through the overcrowded barracks in regular devastating waves, leaving the weakest prisoners bedridden and delirious. Medical care consisted of little more than occasional aspirin tablets and filthy bandages that were changed far too infrequently by overwhelmed camp personnel. But perhaps even more psychologically devastating than the constant physical deprivation was the paralyzing terror that consumed them every waking moment. Carefully orchestrated radio broadcasts and strategically whispered propaganda had systematically filled their traumatized minds with absolutely horrifying stories about what supposedly happened when American forces liberated German camps and towns. Their sadistic guards had gleefully shared increasingly detailed tales of Allied soldiers who allegedly showed no mercy whatsoever to German women, who supposedly treated all civilians as guilty enemies deserving of the most brutal revenge imaginable. These terrifying stories, whether rooted in actual truth or deliberately manufactured by increasingly desperate Nazi officials, had taken deep root in their collective imagination like spreading psychological poison. As the ominous thunder of approaching artillery grew noticeably closer each passing day, the terrorized women huddled together in their freezing barracks, sharing their mounting existential terror in voices barely above frightened whispers. Some prayed desperately to a God they weren't entirely certain was still listening to their pleas. Others simply stared blankly at the rotting walls, trying desperately to steel themselves mentally for whatever horrific fate awaited them when the dreaded Americans finally arrived at their camp. 300 women had spent months preparing to die at American hands. The rumble of approaching engines would soon test whether their fears were justified or if something entirely different awaited them in the depths of the Bavarian forest. That rumble grew louder as the first American Jeep broke through the tree line at exactly 8:47 in the morning, its engine cutting through the forest silence like a blade. Behind it came 2 more vehicles, then infantry soldiers on foot, their rifles ready but pointed downward. The women inside the barracks could see them now through the grimy windows, these foreign soldiers they had been taught to fear above all else. Inside Barrack 7, a young woman named Greta pressed her face against the cold glass, her breath fogging the window as she watched the Americans approach the camp gates. At 19, she had once dreamed of becoming a nurse in her hometown of Munich. Now she clutched a thin blanket around her shoulders, her blonde hair cropped short and uneven from a bout of lice months earlier. Her hands trembled as she whispered a prayer her grandmother had taught her as a child, the same prayer she had recited every night since being torn from her family's bakery 2 years ago. The other women gathered behind her, their faces pale with terror that had been carefully cultivated by months of relentless propaganda. An older woman named Margaret, who had been a respected schoolteacher in a small Bavarian village before the war, stood with her protective arm around Elsa, a girl barely 16 whose parents had been killed in an Allied bombing raid. They had all heard the stories, repeated endlessly by their guards, until the tales became indistinguishable from truth. American soldiers who took what they wanted from conquered territories, men who showed no distinction between soldiers and civilians, between the guilty and the innocent. The jeep stopped just outside the main gate with a mechanical precision that somehow felt more threatening than chaotic violence would have been. American soldiers climbed out slowly, their movements cautious but deliberate, like predators studying their prey. They wore olive-green uniforms marked with white stars and carried equipment the women didn't recognize, but assumed was designed for inflicting maximum suffering. One soldier approached the gate while others spread out in defensive positions that reminded the women of hunting formations. What happened next defied everything they had been conditioned to expect through months of psychological preparation for this moment. Instead of kicking down the gate with explosive violence or shouting harsh orders in their foreign tongue, the American soldier at the entrance examined the rusted lock with almost scholarly curiosity. He called out something to his companions in English, words that sounded surprisingly calm rather than threatening, then produced a pair of wire cutters from his pack. He worked methodically, almost gently, to cut through the chain that had held them prisoner for so long. The women watched in confused silence as the Americans entered their camp with an unexpected restraint that contradicted every terrifying story they had heard. They expected immediate violence, expected to be herded together like cattle and marched away at gunpoint to face mass execution. Instead, the soldiers moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if they too were uncertain about what they would find inside these weathered barracks that had housed so much suffering. A weathered sergeant with graying hair at his temples and tired eyes that spoke of too many battles approached Barrack 7. The women inside retreated instinctively from the windows, huddling together in the center of the room, like frightened deer sensing a predator. They could hear his boots on the wooden steps leading to their door, each footfall echoing in their minds like the countdown to their execution. When the door creaked open on its rusted hinges, brilliant sunlight streamed in, silhouetting the American soldier in the doorway like some figure from their worst nightmares. He was shorter than they had expected, more human somehow, with genuinely tired eyes and several days of stubble on his weathered jaw. He looked around the cramped room slowly, methodically taking in the sight of nearly 40 women pressed together like frightened animals awaiting slaughter. His expression transformed gradually from military alertness to something softer, something that might have been genuine pity rather than the cruel satisfaction they had been told to expect. He spoke carefully, but his words were in English, and none of the women understood the foreign syllables. His tone, however, was not the harsh bark of command they had anticipated based on their guards' descriptions. It was quiet, almost gentle, carrying an unexpected warmth that confused and disoriented them. Most remarkably, he held up his hands with palms open in what seemed to be a universal gesture of peace rather than dominance. Then he stepped back deliberately, giving them space, as if he somehow understood that his very presence terrified them beyond rational thought. This simple act of consideration was so contrary to everything they had been taught about American soldiers that it left them speechless. From somewhere deep in the huddle, a woman began to sob uncontrollably. The sound broke the spell of terrified silence that had held them all frozen in place. Soon others were crying too, not from immediate pain, but from overwhelming relief and profound confusion that their minds couldn't yet process. They were still alive. The Americans had not immediately shot them or dragged them away to face torture. Whatever was about to happen next would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies and themselves. What was about to happen next would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies and themselves. The sergeant stepped back further from the doorway, giving the terrified women even more space, then turned to call something over his shoulder to his fellow soldiers. Within minutes, more Americans appeared, but they weren't carrying weapons or restraints. Instead, they carried wooden crates and canvas bags that clinked softly with the sound of metal containers. The first soldier to approach the barracks again was younger, perhaps 22, with freckles across his sunburned nose and kind eyes that reminded Greta painfully of her younger brother Heinrich, who had been conscripted 2 years earlier and never returned. This American soldier moved with deliberate slowness, as if approaching wild animals that might bolt at any sudden movement. He set down a wooden crate just inside the doorway, then backed away several steps, his hands visible and empty. The women stared at the crate as if it might explode. None of them moved toward it, their conditioning having taught them that anything offered by soldiers came with a terrible price. The silence stretched between the two groups, broken only by the distant sound of more vehicles arriving and American voices calling to each other in their incomprehensible language. Finally, the young soldier began to mime eating, bringing his hand to his mouth repeatedly while pointing at the crate. When this produced no response except increased cowering, he reached slowly into his own pack and withdrew a small tin. He opened it carefully, the metal top peeling back with a soft pop that made several women flinch. The sweet aroma of preserved peaches filled the air, a scent so foreign and wonderful that some of the women involuntarily leaned forward. The soldier took a spoonful of the fruit, eating it slowly while making exaggerated sounds of enjoyment. Then he set the tin down beside the crate and stepped back again, gesturing from the food to the women with open palms. The message was clear, even across the language barrier. This food was for them, not him. Margaret, the former schoolteacher, was the first to understand. She had spent years reading body language in classrooms, interpreting the unspoken communications of children who couldn't or wouldn't voice their needs. This American soldier was trying to tell them something that contradicted everything their guards had programmed them to believe. He was offering them food without demanding anything in return. She whispered something in German to the other women, her voice hoarse from months of barely speaking. Several heads turned toward her, eyes wide with disbelief. The idea that these foreign soldiers might actually intend to feed them rather than harm them was so revolutionary that their minds struggled to process it. More Americans had appeared outside the barracks, but they maintained their distance, forming a loose semicircle that somehow felt protective rather than threatening. One of them, an older soldier with corporal stripes on his sleeve, was speaking quietly into a radio device. Others were opening more crates, revealing glimpses of canned goods, medical supplies, and what appeared to be clean clothing. The young soldier with freckles tried a different approach. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wrapped object, unwrapping it to reveal a bar of soap. The white rectangle caught the sunlight streaming through the doorway, and several women gasped audibly. Soap had become more precious than gold in the camp. The women hadn't had access to real soap in over a year, forced to wash themselves and their clothes with cold water and sometimes sand when they could find it. He held the soap up where everyone could see it, then placed it gently beside the tin of peaches. The gesture was so simple, so human, that it began to crack the shell of terror that had encased the women's hearts for months. This wasn't the behavior of monsters preparing to torture them. This was the behavior of people who understood suffering and wanted to alleviate it. Elsa, the 16-year-old whose parents had died in the bombing, took a tentative step forward. The movement was so slight that it was barely perceptible, but the American soldier noticed immediately. He smiled at her, a genuine expression of warmth that lit up his young face, and nodded encouragingly. He said something in English, his tone gentle and encouraging, though none of the women understood the words. The girl looked back at Margaret, seeking permission or perhaps courage. The older woman nodded slowly, her own eyes filling with tears as she recognized the magnitude of what was happening. Everything they had been told about these soldiers was proving to be a lie. Instead of the brutal savages described in Nazi propaganda, they were encountering young men who seemed to understand compassion. Elsa took another step, then another, until she was close enough to reach out and touch the bar of soap. Her fingers trembled as they made contact with its smooth surface, and she brought it to her nose to inhale its clean scent. The smell was so pure, so reminiscent of the life she had known before the war, that tears began streaming down her hollow cheeks. But what these women were experiencing was only the beginning of a transformation that would challenge not just their preconceptions about their captors, but their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of mercy. But what these women were experiencing was only the beginning of a transformation that would challenge not just their preconceptions about their captors, but their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that seemed to have forgotten the meaning of mercy. As word spread through the other barracks that the Americans were distributing food and supplies rather than implementing the mass executions they had all feared, a cautious migration began throughout the camp. Women emerged from their hiding places like creatures emerging from hibernation, blinking in the bright afternoon sunlight they had rarely been allowed to enjoy. Many were so weak from malnutrition that they had to support each other just to walk the short distance from their barracks to where the American soldiers had established a makeshift distribution center. The sight that greeted the Americans was more devastating than any battlefield they had encountered during their advance through Europe. Corporal James Murphy, the radio operator who had been coordinating with headquarters, later wrote in his diary that seeing these women was like witnessing ghosts trying to return to the world of the living. Their clothes hung on skeletal frames, their hair was patchy and dull from poor nutrition, and their eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of experiences no human should have to endure. Many bore visible scars and bruises that told stories of systematic abuse and neglect. Yet what struck the American soldiers most profoundly was not the physical evidence of suffering, but the psychological damage that manifested in the women's behavior. They moved in groups, never alone, constantly looking over their shoulders as if expecting punishment for the simple act of existing. When offered food, many would snatch it quickly and hide it in their clothes, unable to believe that more would be available later. Some flinched at sudden movements or loud noises, their bodies remembering trauma even when their minds tried to forget. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a U.S. Army nurse who arrived with the medical team later that afternoon, documented what she found in clinical terms that barely captured the human reality. Severe malnutrition was universal among the prisoners, with many showing signs of vitamin deficiencies that had caused bleeding gums, loose teeth, and skin conditions. Respiratory infections were common due to overcrowding and poor ventilation in the barracks. Most disturbingly, many women showed signs of systematic physical abuse that went far beyond the normal hardships of wartime privation. The American response to these discoveries was swift and comprehensive, driven by a combination of military efficiency and genuine human compassion. Medical personnel established a field hospital in one of the larger barracks, while cooks began preparing hot meals using both military rations and supplies requisitioned from nearby German towns. Soldiers volunteered their own personal items, sharing cigarettes, soap, and even family photographs to help bridge the communication gap with the traumatized women. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the American intervention was what didn't happen. Despite months of propaganda warnings about Allied brutality, not a single documented case of abuse or mistreatment occurred during the liberation and subsequent care of the camp. Military police were stationed throughout the facility, but their role was to protect the women from any potential misconduct by their own troops rather than to guard against escape attempts. Private Tommy Rodriguez, barely 19 himself and homesick for his family's farm in California, found himself assigned to help distribute clothing donations that had been collected from nearby towns. He later recalled the moment when he handed a clean dress to a woman about his mother's age, watching as she held the fabric against her face and wept with gratitude. The gesture reminded him powerfully of his own mother's reaction to receiving new clothes during the hard years of the Depression. The language barrier created challenges, but human kindness proved to be surprisingly universal. Soldiers used gestures, drawings, and shared smiles to communicate basic needs and reassurances. Some of the women who had been teachers or who had studied English before the war began to serve as informal translators, helping to bridge the gap between the two groups. These conversations, halting and limited as they were, began to reveal the full scope of what these women had endured. Greta, the young woman who had dreamed of becoming a nurse, found herself drawn to the American medical personnel. Despite having no formal training, her natural empathy and her fluency in both German and broken English made her invaluable in helping the medical team understand the specific needs and fears of different patients. Dr. Mitchell quickly recognized Greta's potential and began teaching her basic first aid techniques, creating an informal apprenticeship that would prove life-changing for both women. As the days passed and trust slowly began to replace terror, the women started to share their individual stories with their liberators. These accounts painted a picture of systematic exploitation that went far beyond simple labor conscription. Many had been separated from their families under false pretenses, promised work that would help the war effort only to find themselves trapped in brutal conditions with no hope of escape or communication with loved ones. The psychological healing process was slow and complex, complicated by years of conditioning and trauma that couldn't be erased by simple acts of kindness. But something fundamental was changing in the camp, something that would resonate far beyond the immediate relief of physical suffering and transform how these women understood their place in a world that was rapidly changing around them. But something fundamental was changing in the camp, something that would resonate far beyond the immediate relief of physical suffering and transform how these women understood their place in a world that was rapidly changing around them. The transformation wasn't just physical, though the improvements in that realm were dramatic enough. Within a week of liberation, proper nutrition and medical care had begun to restore color to hollow cheeks and brightness to eyes that had been dulled by despair. The real change was occurring at a deeper level, in the gradual rebuilding of human dignity that had been systematically stripped away through years of dehumanizing treatment. For the first time in months or years, these women were being treated as individuals rather than as units of labor or burdens to be managed. American soldiers learned their names, asked about their backgrounds, and showed genuine interest in their hopes for the future. Margaret, the former schoolteacher, found herself in long conversations with Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, the commanding officer who had taken personal responsibility for the camp's administration. Hayes, a former high school principal from Ohio, recognized in Margaret a kindred spirit who understood the importance of education and human development. Through their halting conversations in broken English and gestures, they began planning educational programs for the younger women who had been denied schooling during their imprisonment. The documentation process that the Americans undertook was meticulous and revealing, painting a comprehensive picture of the systematic abuse that had characterized the Nazi labor program. Military investigators interviewed each woman individually, recording testimonies that would later become crucial evidence in war crimes tribunals. These interviews revealed that the camp had been part of a vast network of facilities designed to exploit civilian labor for the German war machine. Many of the women had been recruited through deceptive means, promised legitimate employment in factories or domestic service, only to find themselves trapped in conditions that amounted to slavery. Others had been conscripted more directly, taken from their homes by local officials who were filling quotas imposed by higher authorities. Once in the system, they had been moved frequently to prevent them from establishing connections or escape routes. The testimonies also revealed the psychological tactics used to maintain control over the prisoners. Guards had deliberately spread rumors about Allied brutality to discourage escape attempts in cooperation with advancing American forces. Women were told that their families would be punished if they tried to flee, and that capture by American soldiers would result in torture and execution. These lies had been reinforced by staged executions and public beatings that served as object lessons for the rest of the camp population. Dr. Mitchell's medical examinations provided clinical confirmation of the systematic abuse. Beyond malnutrition and disease, she documented evidence of physical violence that appeared to have been used as both punishment and intimidation. Many women bore scars from beatings administered for minor infractions, like speaking too loudly or moving too slowly during work assignments. The psychological impact of this constant threat of violence was evident in the hypervigilance and anxiety that characterized most of the survivors. Yet alongside these disturbing revelations, the American personnel began to witness remarkable demonstrations of human resilience and the capacity for recovery. Women who had been reduced to mere survival began to rediscover aspects of their personalities that had been buried under layers of trauma. Some revealed artistic talents, creating small drawings or crafts from materials provided by their liberators. Others demonstrated leadership qualities, organizing themselves to help care for the weakest members of their group. Elsa, the 16-year-old who had been among the first to accept food from the American soldiers, proved to have a remarkable gift for languages. She quickly picked up enough English to serve as an informal interpreter, and her youth and resilience made her a bridge between the traumatized older women and their well-meaning but sometimes awkward liberators. Her quick smile and determination to learn became symbols of hope for the entire camp. The Americans, for their part, found themselves profoundly affected by their encounters with these survivors. Many soldiers wrote letters home describing their experiences, letters that provided some of the first detailed accounts of Nazi labor camps to reach American families. These personal testimonies would play an important role in shaping American understanding of the war's impact on civilian populations. Private Rodriguez, the young soldier from California, began teaching some of the women basic English phrases while learning German words in return. These informal language exchanges became social events that brought laughter to the camp for the first time in years. The sound of genuine laughter, he later wrote to his family, was more beautiful than any music he had ever heard because it represented the return of joy to lives that had been stripped of everything except the will to survive. As spring turned toward summer and the war in Europe officially ended with Germany's surrender, the question of what would happen to these women became increasingly urgent. Many had no homes to return to, their families scattered or killed during the final chaotic months of the conflict. Others feared returning to communities that might view them with suspicion or shame because of their association with the labor camps. The Americans found themselves not just liberators, but temporary guardians of people whose futures remained deeply uncertain despite their physical freedom. The Americans found themselves not just liberators, but temporary guardians of people whose futures remained deeply uncertain despite their physical freedom. As the immediate crisis of survival gave way to longer-term planning, the complexity of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by years of systematic abuse became increasingly apparent. The war's end brought legal freedom, but true liberation would prove to be a much more complicated and lengthy process. The displaced persons camps that were being established throughout occupied Germany represented both hope and uncertainty for the survivors. While these facilities offered safety and basic necessities, they also served as reminders that these women existed in a kind of limbo between their traumatic past and an unclear future. Many struggled with the psychological transition from the rigid control of the labor camp to the relative freedom of the displaced persons facilities, finding that the absence of constant supervision and threat could be almost as disorienting as the abuse itself. Greta's transformation during this period exemplified both the possibilities and challenges of recovery. Her work with Dr. Mitchell had revealed a natural aptitude for medical care that had been suppressed during her years of forced labor. With the doctor's encouragement and teaching, she began to develop skills that would eventually allow her to pursue her childhood dream of becoming a nurse. Yet her progress was marked by setbacks and moments of panic when memories of her imprisonment would suddenly overwhelm her newfound confidence. The process of reconnecting with surviving family members proved to be both heartbreaking and miraculous. Red Cross workers and military personnel worked tirelessly to locate relatives and establish communication with scattered survivors. Some women discovered that their entire families had perished during the war, leaving them completely alone in the world. Others experienced the overwhelming joy of learning that loved ones had survived and were searching for them. Margaret's reunion with her husband, a veteran who had been captured on the Eastern Front and had only recently been released from a Soviet prisoner camp, illustrated the complex emotions involved in these reunifications. Both had endured traumas that the other could barely comprehend, and both had changed in fundamental ways during their years of separation. Their reunion was tearful and joyful, but it also marked the beginning of a difficult process of learning to know each other again and to build a relationship based on who they had become rather than who they had been before the war. The documentation efforts undertaken by American forces during and after the liberation proved to have lasting historical significance. The testimonies collected from the camp survivors became part of the extensive record that would later be used in war crimes prosecutions and historical research. These accounts provided crucial evidence of the systematic nature of Nazi forced labor programs and their impact on civilian populations throughout occupied Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, drawing on his background in education, established formal classes within the displaced persons camp that allowed women to continue their interrupted educations or learn new skills that would help them build independent lives. These programs became models for similar efforts throughout the American occupation zone, demonstrating the importance of addressing not just immediate physical needs, but also the long-term requirements for psychological and social recovery. The American soldiers who had participated in the liberation carried their experiences with them as they returned to civilian life in the United States. Many became advocates for displaced persons immigration programs, using their first-hand knowledge of the survivors' situations to argue for more generous American policies toward European refugees. Their testimonies helped shape American understanding of the war's impact on civilian populations and the moral obligations that came with victory. For the German women themselves, the long process of rebuilding their lives continued for years, and in some cases, decades after their liberation. Many eventually emigrated to new countries, including the United States, where they built successful careers and families, while carrying within them the memories of both suffering and unexpected mercy. Others remained in Germany, contributing to the difficult process of rebuilding a society that had produced the system that had enslaved them. The legacy of their encounter with American liberators remained a defining memory for most survivors. In later interviews and testimonies, many emphasized not just the physical relief of liberation, but the psychological impact of being treated with dignity and respect by soldiers who could easily have viewed them as enemies. The restraint and compassion shown by these American forces stood in stark contrast to both their previous treatment under the Nazi regime and the vengeful behavior they had been conditioned to expect from their enemies. Decades later, as historians and researchers worked to document the full scope of Nazi crimes against civilian populations, the testimonies of these women provided crucial insights into both the mechanics of oppression and the possibilities for human resilience and recovery. Their stories served as reminders that even in the darkest chapters of human history, individual acts of kindness and dignity could plant seeds of hope that would continue to grow long after the immediate crisis had passed. The transformation of terror into trust, of despair into possibility, remained one of the most remarkable aspects of their liberation story. It demonstrated that mercy, when offered genuinely and consistently, possessed the power to begin healing wounds that seemed too deep for any remedy. In a world torn apart by unprecedented violence and hatred, these moments of human connection across enemy lines offered glimpses of what might be possible when people chose compassion over vengeance, understanding over prejudice.